This is a quick recording about the importance of emotional intelligence as we think about ourselves in leadership roles. And so, to get started, as we think about any type of change or supporting our staff or working towards a greater fidelity of implementation, whatever it is that we're trying to do in this complex world of ours, a lot of factors come into play in terms of whether or not we will get to the change that we seek. And so this grid about managing complex change has been adapted a little bit to talk about two other things, one of which, of course, is emotional intelligence, and the other is the impact of our age in terms of how much energy or effort it takes to do something different, something that's not part of our autopilot, something that's not part of our comfort zone or our neural pathways. So we're really seeking change. And so the common way we think about that is, well, do we have a vision? Do we have skills? Do we have incentives? Do we have the resources? Do we have an action plan? And so we're going to argue that age and EQ will also play into this, what we get in the end. Now, when we are missing a piece of vision, skills, incentives, and so forth, we end up with behaviors that tend to drive us crazy. So even the best leader can get a little bit frustrated when people are repeatedly confused or really anxious to the point where it pushes them to either withdraw or become hyper aroused. For sure, resistance is a big issue that all leaders face, and even just the frustration of our staff and our colleagues. And everyone gets really annoyed with false starts. But what is the impact of age and EQ in terms of also producing these behaviors? And then we have to then see the adult behind the behavior. So why are we talking about emotional intelligence? And then I'll say a few things about the age issue as well. So emotional intelligence matters. Sometimes people will call it EI because for emotional intelligence, but it's an emotional intelligence quotient. So we call it EQ. It plays a role in the success across our lifespan. And so from when children are very young, we're trying to build this all throughout the lifespan. But many times we may be working with adults who don't have or haven't had the opportunity to raise their emotional intelligence. And their emotional intelligence is going to impact anything that they then do, think, believe, try out, or anything that they resist. And this certainly impacts the children and the families that we serve as well. So when we look at the grid, we see that it is a little bit blurry anywhere that EQ comes into play. Meaning if we don't have a strong EQ, it's just going to be up and down. Sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. Sometimes I'm not confused, sometimes I am confused. When we think about the age variable, it's blacked out a little bit, but that's just, there's a little grid behind it that says it's slowed down. Meaning the older that we are, while we might increase our emotional intelligence, it also becomes harder for us to change or to do things differently or to learn. Now, this is kind of birelational. If my emotional intelligence is strong, I will probably have a growth mindset. I will probably be willing to have people help me or take risks and try and not be, kind of set back if I fail. If I have strong emotional intelligence, I probably have really good coping strategies for when something takes me a long time or I get frustrated with the change process. When I don't have strong emotional intelligence and I get older and older and older, it's going to take more effort for me to change or to learn or to do something different. That effort is going to be a stressor on my overall system. And when my overall system gets stressed, that limbic alarm goes off. And that's when we start to see the behaviors, the confusion, the anxiety, the resistance, the frustration, because my limbic alarm has gone off and I don't have the emotional intelligence to figure out how to offer myself a lifeline and how to apply coping strategies to get through that situation. Now, there's also a downside in terms of age because the younger I am, my brain is still developing. And so while it's more placid and able to not need as much energy to change, it's also still developing. And so I might not have a strong emotional intelligence if I'm only 18 or 20 or even 25. So while my brain is becoming more integrated and differentiated, I may not have strong emotional intelligence yet. So At the end of this recording, I hope you understand that you will absolutely have a higher EQ just from having talked about your emotional intelligence and talking about a few things, greater clarity about what EQ is, and some specific strategies to raise your EQ in the areas of self-awareness and self-regulation. So there's a lot of different definitions or variations, I probably should say, about what emotional intelligence is. For me, I often think of it as very similar to what people will call mindfulness. It's this noticing. It's this noticing what's going on inside of me, and it's noticing what's going on around me. And when I'm able to notice and do that without judgment or without reaction or without flipping my lid, then I have what we would say is a strong emotional intelligence. So we have a quiz for EQ leaders. If you haven't taken it, you might want to pause and do that now. It's interesting to see what your strengths are. Sometimes it's quite surprising where you come out strong or where you might need some work yourself. And so one element of one element of EQ is self-awareness. And this is that noticing, but it's not only noticing, but really understanding my emotions. But when I understand my emotions, I'm able to notice that I'm becoming hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, maybe frustrated, anxious, rigid. But now I can use my strengths. I can really capitalize upon them and take those strengths and leverage them for a way to help them become a coping strategy. I'm also very aware of my own biases, especially as those of us who are white and part of the white dominant culture. We need to be anti-racist in our work in professional development and in supporting those who are members of the early care and education revolution. So a strong emotional intelligence is necessary in our efforts to really become anti-racist in our work in supporting young children and their families. That means we also have to be aware of our emotional triggers. Did it just trigger for some of you that I talked about the white dominant culture, or asking you to be aware of, for those of you who are white, your biases? That's a trigger. Sometimes it could be the look of a person. Sometimes it could be the non-look. And so we're really talking about understanding our strengths, our limitations, our biases, and then ultimately we want to be able to have some control over those emotions, how we respond. Control doesn't mean self-control per se. It's really about being able to manage the energy and tensions of the stressors, of the triggers, and then be able to respond versus react. When we think about self-regulation, again, thinking from a Stuart Shanker perspective around self-reg, this isn't about self-control, but this is about the ability to manage energy and stressors, and then to be able to adapt. So really understanding what's the best response in this situation. How can I regulate maybe better than control my emotional reactions? I want to be productive and authentic, so I need to be aware of when I'm becoming hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused and know how I can reduce stressors in my own life and remain some sort of balance so that I can take those energies and tensions and not allow them to let that limbic alarm go off to the point where I go to freeze or faint, fight or flight, freeze or faint, but rather I'm able to put the limbic brakes on, keep my prefrontal cortex in the game, and do things that are really in the best interest of everyone. I'm able to take the perspective of others, problem solve, and so forth. The third thing is situational awareness, and this is really the ability to understand what's going around me. So remember I said EQ is noticing what's going on in the self, but also outside of the self, and really noticing why it's happening, not taking things personally, not thinking in conspiracies, not thinking that things are out to get you, even though some staff and colleagues may feel like that about you sometimes. You might feel about them sometimes, but it's really being mindful, being present, noticing what the issues, the concerns are, and then really thinking about what are my relationships with these other people. Do we have relational trust? Are things breaking down because we don't have the core of a relationship? What are group dynamics? Can I predict what might happen? And this isn't predicting in the sense of like, oh, this person, they're going to do that again, and walking around on eggshells or assuming incompetence. We always want to presume competence and always think about what might be different this time around. But we want to really think about this sort of forward thinking so that we can notice when people are becoming overstressed, and then we can take action in the future to keep that from happening. So that's situational awareness. Social awareness is this big thing where we change a want into a need. And the older the person is, the harder this is for us. For many of us, when we're working with young children, we're very much able to go, oh, I should really see this as the child needing something. But when they're an adult, we're sort of like wanting them to do 50% of the work. And so as a leader, sometimes it's your job in building the emotional intelligence of your staff or your colleagues is to do more of the heavy lifting. So social awareness in leaders requires that you see adults needing something from you. They may need your calm to be calm. They may need you to co-regulate or offer them a coping strategy. They may need you to build their emotional intelligence. And so when we can act with empathy, whether that is any of the facets of empathy that Dan Siegel talks about, this notion that I can sort of take the perspective of others, or even compassionate empathy where I'm compelled to do something because I notice that you are struggling. This really being present again, this active listening, using good communication skills, not just that we listen and then hurry them along, but that we actually engage in what Alyssa Bloss-Campbell from Seed & Sow would talk about in terms of being an emotional coach. And we allow them to process big emotions. We allow them to process what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and we don't try to fix it, solve it, give advice too quickly. And then the fifth part of emotional intelligence, for the way that I've constructed it, is spirituality. And that one always kind of trips people up, because spirituality is often thought of as either tied to religion, or sometimes people will differentiate and say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. For me, spiritual is really building upon the work of Parker Palmer. And it's this idea that as a leader, I'm casting more light and less shadow. So when I'm connected with myself, when I'm connected with others, when I'm connected and passionate with the content, when I'm connected and all present with the context and where I'm working, then I'm able to notice where I can shed more light and less shadow. I can still be myself. I don't have to try to be the ought self, what people think I ought to be, but I can be my ideal self, where I really am promoting positive change by connecting and collaborating, versus when I personally am casting shadow, it's when I am feeling like I'm never enough, or that we're in a rut and the time is like clicking by and deadlines are coming and we keep repeating the same error and we're not getting anywhere. And I don't feel like people are listening to me, or that I'm being clear, even though I've said it 100 times. Well, we remember that when we said something 100 times, the person's not the slow learner. So that means I have to take a step back and say, what is it about this deadline or this project or this meeting that is causing other people to be overstressed? Maybe it's a mirror neuron in the sense of our interbrain relationship, and that my stress and my anxiety and my frustration is now being felt by my colleagues and staff, and they're going to now show that back to me, and it's just a spiral. And so then I can get kind of snarky, and I don't aim to connect. I just go, never mind. I'm going to take all my power, all my tasks, all my to-do, and I'll just do it. That's me casting more shadow than light. Or when I am not patient with people, or you can tell by my facial expression that I am not listening, but I'm kind of stewing on stuff. So spirituality is this notion that because we have emotional intelligence from those other parts, that I feel very connected to my authentic self, and that my goal is to shed more light by promoting positive change, and that I'm always looking for connection and collaboration and co-regulation over wielding whatever power I may believe I have or that has been given to me. Because for me, I'm part of the white dominant culture, so I have to be really aware of that power and that I use it only in ways that promote positive connections. Okay, so let's get a few strategies quickly. For self-awareness, we want to really think about our strengths and our triggers because that's the light and the dark again. So you know from my work that we talk a lot about your superpowers. This is from my work with Myra Parada, where we talk about superpowers. There's 32 of them, but really we're just trying to say, what are your gifts and talents? What are the things that you bring to the table? Knowing that sometimes those can be annoying to other people, but we don't want to live our life forgetting that we have superpowers or keeping them hidden because maybe somebody else doesn't like them or hasn't liked them in the past. Maybe someone else that has been in power has silenced us and said that that's not a superpower. And so we've come to believe that it's not. And so a strong emotional intelligence in a leader is one that really knows what their strengths are, even those that were forgotten, hidden, or silenced. That also means we have to look at what are our triggers? What are the things that make us flip our lid? What are the things that cause our limbic system to send off an alarm and for us not to be able to put the brakes on? This is where we end up going into fight or flight, freeze or faint. We become very reactionary and we're not our best selves. So we really want to make sure that we're clear about our triggers or the times of day, what things are going on that are likely to cause a trigger for us. And whenever possible, we reduce those stressors or create things in the environment to keep that shark music turned down. One of the things from my friend Petra Kolber, who's the author of The Perfection Detox, she talks about rumination mindset versus reflection mindset. So if you have a reflection mindset, that's where you're really using your self-awareness. And that self-awareness in reflection helps you stay present, work with the reality that you are in right now, not where you were yesterday or where you may be in 30 seconds. And you work with the facts. You really have a self-compassionate lens because if you can't be compassionate to yourself, it's very hard to be compassionate to others. You're very solution-focused, but not in a way that is rushing people to find the product or the end. You really see challenges as opportunities. You're easily the first one to take action or be ready for action, and you sort of leave the doubt demons at home. Now, rumination mindset, on the other hand, is the woulda, shoulda, coulda people. This is me. You woulda, shoulda, coulda just about anything in your life. Always thinking that a different outcome might have been a better outcome. You fill in the blanks before you have the facts. You sort of make some assumptions based upon very little information or based upon a gut feeling or based upon past. You can use a very critical lens of self-judgment. You sometimes focus more on the problem. We call that admiring the problem. And sometimes you see a challenge as a threat. So somebody might be presenting something that's not working, but you see that as a threat that you haven't thought it all the way through, or you didn't give it enough thought, or you weren't prepared enough. And so that can often lead to paralysis because you see this as a problem that you must alone fix, and you don't reach out or think about how to leverage the strengths of others in order to solve the problem. And then that leads to that doubt demon, that imposter identity, that I'm really not supposed to be the leader, that they see that I'm not a good leader, and now everyone knows. The last few strategies around self-regulation, this ability to manage tensions and energy and then be able to adapt to these changing circumstances are things where we really are promoting our yes brain. And so this is where we're really trying to do things inside ourselves that we look for balance, but the balance isn't a work-life balance. It's not a 50-50 balance. It's really this state that we are in the green zone, that we're sort of this stability and ability to be differentiated but yet linked, and that there's this body and brain integration, that we can move through challenges with our strengths, that we understand ourselves and we understand other people, and that we can demonstrate empathy. And so whenever we're not in the yes brain, it's because we're in a context or we ourselves are focusing on rules, standardization, compliance, and fear. So if we're choosing that sort of shadow self, we're not staying self-regulated, we're flipping our lid. It could be our context, it could be our agency or our project or our district is really working from a place of these are the rules, everybody must do it, you must do it right now or something bad's going to happen to you. As a leader, especially now, we want to do the opposite of that. We can have guidelines for people, parameters and predictability. We can have systematic ways to move through things. We can certainly have compassion and connection over compliance, and we don't want to live in a place of fear. We can do things that keep us safe, keep the limbic alarm turned off, but we don't want to add more fear. So that leaves us to really thinking about how do we work with our staff and colleagues in a teach before the peak sort of framework. And that's going to be part 2 of this recording, where we're going to talk about, let's say I'm at a meeting and somebody goes into the red zone or the blue zone, or 75 people go in the blue zone and 3 go in the red, and I'm trying to keep everybody in the green. How do we, during real life interactions, keep ourselves in the green zone, in that regulation state, that balanced state, that integrated but differentiated, that yes brain? There's a lot of different ways to describe that. And then how do I also help others? And so that's why emotional intelligence is so critical, because it helps us not only stay in the green zone, knowing that sometimes we'll go into the red or blue, but we can not stay there too long, or it won't be too severe. And then we can also start to figure out what we're doing as a leader that extends the green zone for those that we support.